Today we witness in the free world on both sides of the Atlantic some consequences of interventions which are in fact against this set of values.
Richard Joswiak, Radio Free Europe. Two quick questions.
One of the biggest problems today is a real threat when it comes to cyber attacks, fake news, hybrid war, etc. After very clear messages in the last 3 or 4 days, it was, for example, speech from Theresa May in London about hostile activities during the British referendum, for example. We also remember some very brutal events during the elections in some member states in the EU, but also in the United States. This is why we have to be very, very cautious, vigilant, and also honest. If you want to protect ourselves, if you want to help our partners from the Eastern Partnership, we have to, first of all, be aware about the threats inside the EU. And this is why I try to alarm also my compatriots. Your experience, everything is easy.
So.
It is all about Eastern Europe. So they're talking about things like security, shared challenges, and it's not only attended by EU states. Pretty much everyone bordering Russia was invited, so countries like Ukraine and Georgia were there as well. And not many of them have many good things to say about Russia. Certainly today, the forum was heavily focused on the issue of Russia, and some of the strongest criticism came from the EU Council President Donald Tusk. Take a listen.
In the, 10th row.
One of the biggest problems today is a real threat when it comes to cyber attacks, fake news. For example, speech from Theresa May in London about hostile activities during the British referendum, for example.
So Donald Tusk referring there to that foreign policy speech that Theresa May gave last week, where she tore into Moscow. She accused the Kremlin of attempting to undermine Western democratic values through election interference and planting fake news stories. But, and this is a pretty important but, especially for Donald Tusk, she clarified later on in the week that those sort of Russian misdeeds that she referred to weren't specifically in relation to the UK. Take a listen.
If they care to look at the speech I gave on Monday, they will see that the examples I gave of Russian interference were not in the United Kingdom.
Well, Donald Tusk clearly didn't get that particular memo from London, and this looks now like a case of sort of classic Chinese whispers, really, where the facts don't really matter because it fits an overarching narrative, and that is of Russia as a threat to the whole of Europe. It's a narrative that perhaps rather conveniently unifies the EU and the UK at a time when they have little else in common. And Theresa May had more to say about Russia at the summit today. Take a listen.
We must be open-eyed about the actions of hostile states like Russia, who threaten the potential growth of the eastern neighbourhood and who try to tear our collective strength apart. And I'm looking forward today to renewed commitments from European countries to working together to tackle these shared challenges in both security and development.
And despite the fact that the UK is actively negotiating its way out of the European Union right now, at this summit, this EU summit today, the UK's pledged to spend £100 million on countering what it calls Russian disinformation in Eastern Europe. There's a further £50 million from London going towards reform and security in Eastern Europe as well. And talk of Russia really appears quite fruitful from a domestic perspective. Here in the UK, it's kind of managed to draw the fire away from extensive media coverage of ministers' inappropriate behaviour, scandals to do with that, and constant talk of how fragile Theresa May's government is.
Very strong terminology, and of course that does play well domestically, but it's also quite useful in the context of the negotiations with the European Union, because the United Kingdom thinks the security card is a strong one for it to play in those negotiations, and particularly to win support from countries in Eastern Europe.
Well, and what did you make of Donald Tusk too? Because both of them seem to be acting in tandem today, but I don't know if you caught the comments from Tusk. He didn't seem that convincing when he was pushed on evidence, particularly relating to Britain and Brexit.
No, well, there seemed to be some confusion between the two of them about what they were actually saying, and certainly he didn't seem to have very much in the way of the evidence for the particular statements he was trying to make. But of course the backcloth to all this are these very difficult negotiations on Brexit between the United Kingdom and the European Union.
Why do you think Tusk would also join in here, though, at this moment?
Well, I think it's an issue that is perhaps of particular personal concern to him, given his background, and I suppose he wants in some ways to reach out to the United Kingdom, so that I think from his point of view he would want to see these negotiations to be successful, and therefore talking about these security issues is one way of offering some kind of reassurance to the UK.
Were you surprised at the type of language that Theresa May used? I mean, calling Russia a hostile state, saying it's trying to tear our collective sort of states apart in Europe. I mean, she's not mincing her words there, but again, she uses this sort of language and doesn't back it up with specifics.
Well, I was quite surprised at the language. I mean, I think to talk about Russia as a hostile state is very strong language indeed, because one would hope, to have a constructive relationship between the UK, the European Union and Russia, and I don't think that sort of terminology helps the development of such a constructive relationship at all. In fact, because it obviously goes in the opposite direction.
Sure, I was just wondering, I mean, what sort of reaction would we have if it was the opposite, if Russia made that sort of comment about Britain?
Well, I think there'd be a very strong reaction domestically, and of course it would then be produced as further evidence of Russian intentions if that had been the case. But of course, I mean, what Mrs May has had to say in relation to Russia, although it's very strongly worded, is rather vague in terms of specifics.
And do you think people will push her to sort of present evidence now? It just seems to me, Wim, that many people are able to make this sort of comment because it's sort of accepted knowledge that Russia was somehow involved, without actually people pushing to say, OK, well, what's the evidence and what can we draw from it?
Well, I think one of the problems is that people often don't push the evidence. They just accept these statements at face value, and they don't actually look to see what lies behind them in terms of any kind of evidence or supporting argument. They're just accepted because some people have a particular lens of looking at these issues, and that lens is one that is distorted in terms of the perception of Russia.
Sure. OK, Win, look...